Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the top news stories across the state of Washington. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. Washington in Focus is produced by The Center Square. Make sure to go check out all the stories we talk about today and more at thecentersquare.com. Today on Washington in Focus, we'll cover a $45 million state EV program that has seemed to have fallen short of expectations, a Washington bill proposal that would compensate parents, and House Democrats in Olympia changed a 132-year-old rule. All that and more coming up on this edition of Washington in Focus. We'll be right back after this.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. The state of Washington rolled out a $45 million EV electric vehicle program, and a new report seems to indicate it has fallen short of expectations. With more, here's Eliana Kernodle and Carlene Johnson.
Washington State's $45 million electric vehicle instant rebate program for buying or leasing electric vehicles fell far short of promises to deliver environmental results and help middle-income people buy EVs, concluded a Washington Policy Center policy brief released this past week. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Washington reporter, Carlene Johnson. Carlene, what was the goal of the EV rebate program?
Yeah, the goal of this program was to encourage people to buy electric vehicles or lease them or plug-in hybrid vehicles where it can be gas-powered or electric, who might not otherwise be able to afford these vehicles, all in the name of reducing CO2 emissions and meeting some of the pretty lofty goals that former Governor Jay Inslee has set for the state of Washington as far as emissions reductions in the next couple of years. So they had this $45 million set aside, and the Department of Commerce kind of ran the subsidies, if you will, or rebates. And they said, okay, you can receive maybe up to $9,000 off of a new EV lease. And it was supposed to be for lower income or at most moderate income folks, was the idea that, we're going to encourage these people to buy when they might not otherwise be able to. And I guess if the whole goal was to give the money away as fast as they could, Washington Policy Centers said that was met, because within 2.5 months of the funnel opening on this rebate program, it was all swallowed up and those vehicles were purchased. There were some other issues with stated goals that were not met.
Yeah, let's get into that. Did it meet its stated goals?
Yeah, so Washington Policy Center's Vice President for Research, who also heads up their Center for the Environment, Todd Myers, told me, no. I mean, the idea was, first of all, they had a goal that they were going to sell 8,700 vehicles. That's how much it would increase, I should say, EV sales, during the subsidy period. They only ended up selling about 4,800, according to Washington Policy Center, during that time. And it was supposed to reduce emissions by a whole lot, but according to Myers, it was minuscule. Those CO2 emission reductions were 0.03%. So really very little, benefit for the environment at the expense of 45 million taxpayer dollars. So if the goal was to reduce emissions and help people that could otherwise not afford these EVs, Washington Policy Center says it was, an abject failure.
Who took advantage of the subsidies?
Right. So what they did at Washington Policy Center was to look at the zip codes where the people, took advantage of these. So, before the subsidies went into effect in April of 2024, the average income of zip codes where these EVs were being purchased was $122,000. So when the rebates began, I misstated April's when they began. April's when the program was announced. So August is when the program kicked in. Okay. And then, as I mentioned, it was just a little over 2.5 months when all the subsidies were drained. The $45 million bucket was empty. So the median income of the person purchasing these EVs went down to $118,000. Now, it's more money than many of us make, right? But basically the same income level of a person purchasing these EVs. So that means the people that were, moderate to higher incomes were the ones taking advantage of these subsidies, not low to moderate income earners. So again, if that was one of the stated goals from former Governor Inslee, that you're going to let low income people take advantage and get EVs where they normally couldn't have done it. It wasn't that. It was moderate to high income earners across Washington state who were basically given a chunk of money, taxpayer dollars, to buy an electric vehicle. And that was not how it was supposed to work, according to the stated mission.
Will there be another program like this?
Well, that is the big unknown, right? So, former Governor Inslee, just before leaving office, gives his budget proposal, to lawmakers in Olympia and says, rah, the program was so successful. Now, mind you, that came out before Washington Policy Center's sharply critical policy report, right? But he came out and said, his stated reason for why it was so popular is that that money was gone in a blink. That $45 million was gone in 2.5 months. It must have been such a popular program. Well, only popular because people got free money, as it seems. But he said, this is so popular, we need to actually not only repeat this, but increase this for the next biennium. So his budget proposal includes $82 million for another big money giveaway for people that want to purchase EVs and plug-in hybrids. Now, whether or not our new governor, Bob Ferguson, is going to include that in his budget request to lawmakers in Olympia remains to be seen. I did reach out to Ferguson's office and forwarded a copy of WPC's report saying, okay, wait a minute. Supposedly this program is really popular, but the only reason it's popular is because we gave people free money, according to this report. Are you going to pitch this again, especially when we've got, a major budget deficit over the next couple of years here in Washington? Are you going to ask for another $82 million or whatever he asked for to continue the EV program? I did not get a response via my emailed request, Eliana. So I don't know if it's going to be pitched, but I can guarantee you if it is, that you're going to have folks who were critical of this program the first go around hold up this report and say, wait a minute, we didn't reach any of our goals. All we did was give people money to buy nice cars.
A big thanks to Eliana and Carlene for that coverage. You're listening to Washington in Focus, a production of the Center Square. You can check out all the stories we talk about today and much, much more at thecentersquare.com. As legislators are seeing the results and feedback from the EV program, there is another bill circulating in Olympia. That bill would compensate parents of developmentally disabled children. This is something that is not unique to Washington. This is a proposal and a plan that has rolled out in many states across the country. Again, we're going to go back to Eliana Kernodle, but this time she's with Tim Clouser with more.
Washington may soon join Illinois, California, and other states in compensating the parents of developmentally disabled children under legislation considered by the Senate earlier this week. Tim Clouser with the Center Square is here with more. Tim, tell us about this bill and what it would do.
Yeah, so Senate Bill 5211, it was proposed by Senator Noelle Frame. She's a Democrat out of Seattle. It's a bipartisan bill, has a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. It essentially aims to create a program, but to create that program, they're going to need permission from the federal government because it requires using Medicaid funds. This bill essentially asks the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is a federal agency or office, to amend waivers that it offers. Now, one of these waivers is for extraordinary care. So like if a person requires a level of care beyond what the average would be, But these waivers don't allow someone to be paid for that care if they're, say, the person's spouse or they're the parent of a minor child. That isn't included. So this bill essentially asks that office to amend its waivers to allow for parents to be compensated for the extraordinary care of their minor child if they're developmentally challenged. A lot of other states have this in place, like you mentioned, California, Illinois, and there are some differences between those programs, but what Washington is trying to do here certainly isn't unique, and they've tried to do this in the past as recently as last year. Unfortunately, the bill didn't have enough gumption to make it through the legislature, but earlier this week, the Senate Human Services Committee had a public hearing over it. Over a dozen parents testified, many alongside their children, and the consensus among the legislators in the committee, in just the general sense of the hearing, was that it was a popular idea. I do expect it to move forward. We should know here soon whether or not that's going to happen. I do expect it to go forward. Like I said before, the main reason that this aims to create a program is that they need the federal government's permission because it uses Medicaid funds. Now, most of the funding for this program would come from Washington state revenues, about 2/3, but that leaves about 1/3 coming from the Medicaid services. So unless they're given permission from the federal government to do this, they're not able to move forward. And just to get a little bit of stats behind that, it looks like this program would cost about $10.6 million to stand up between now and the fiscal year 2027. But moving forward, each biennium afterwards, so 2027 to 2029, the program would cost $35.3 million, with about 1/3 of that coming from the federal government. Same from 2029 to 2031, it's going to cost about that much.
And part of the reasoning behind this plan is a shortage of caregivers for families like this. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so Washington state already allows a child to essentially receive subsidized care if they need that extraordinary care, but that's through in-home caregivers, and there's just a shortage in the state. Washington state is having a shortage just in childcare in general, so that uniquely hits parents and families with developmentally challenged children. It's harder for daycares to accommodate these kids. So while we're struggling to get daycares, we're also struggling to get those in-home care providers. There is one parent who said she has a young daughter, and throughout her life, she's accumulated over 5,000 unused authorized care hours. That's hours that the state said that they would pay for this worker to do this work for this family. But because there's no workers there, the families aren't getting that subsidy. And essentially, parents are having to quit their own jobs that they go to financially provide for their family in order to just do that day-to-day care that the state's unable to provide due to that shortage.
You mentioned a number of parents did testify on this bill. What were some of the other things that other parents had to say?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke a little bit on it. There's just a lot of parents that had testified that had given up their jobs, some saying their dream jobs. One that stuck out particular to me was this woman who used to work for the city of Bellevue as an arborist. She said she was the Lorax of the street trees, but because of her child's condition, both her and her husband had to give up their full-time jobs to be able to provide that care that the state couldn't. And that was a theme across several people that testified that they can't continue to provide this care at home with no income. Some people had to move out of their homes and away from friends and family. Others are facing cases where they might have to send their child out of state to be institutionalized elsewhere. One parent brought that up and said they were basically told their only other option was to institutionalize their kids somewhere else, likely in Kansas, which already has a program like this that pays back parents for providing this care, ironically. So that was some of the sentiment that was heard among parents, and is very similar to the hearing last year, and was heartfelt by the entire committee.
A big thanks to Eliana and Tim for covering that bill. You're listening to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. Washington in Focus is a production of The Center Square. Go check out these stories at thecentersquare.com. As we deepen into legislative session in Olympia, House Democrats made a change, and it's a notable one. A 132-year-old rule was changed. What was the rule? Why did they change it? And why now? With answers to all that, here's Eliana Kernodle and Brett Davis.
For 132 years, a rule has existed in the Washington State Legislature's House of Representatives requiring a supermajority to suspend debate on a bill that has come to the House floor. Last week, House legislators voted 54-33 to alter that rule so that now only a majority is required to end debate. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Washington State editor, Brett Davis. Brett, it's been 132 years. Why now?
Right. So, as you noted, back on Friday, January 24th, the Democrats in the Washington State House of Representatives decided by a vote of 54-33 to change a longstanding rule. And by that, I mean going all the way back to 1893, that required a supermajority or a 2/3 vote to end debate on the floor. Debate can now be ended with a simple majority vote. To give you some perspective on this, the House is composed of 59 Democrats and 39 Republicans. And to give you even more perspective, that 1893 date, that's only a few years after Washington was admitted to the Union in 1889. So back to your original question of why now, my guess is it has something to do with the chamber's Democratic majority increasing from 58-40 to 59-39 with last year's election. I know Democrats stated rationale for this change, which we're going to get into here in a second, but I think their comfortable majority perhaps emboldened them to take this step. So that would be my guess.
So what were the arguments that proponents made for the bill?
So Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, a Democrat out of Seattle, he said the change was necessary to avoid instances where debate lingers on in an effort to delay the legislative process and potentially stymie legislation favored by the majority party. Basically, he didn't want to see filibustering or lawmakers making the same points or similar points over and over and over again, which again is interesting given the aforementioned majority status Democrats enjoy in the House right now.
And what did opponents have to say?
Opponents, that is Republicans, as you might imagine, were apoplectic about the rule change. As far as I can tell, they were caught off guard by this move by Democrats. Rep. Travis Couture, he's a Republican from Allen. He argued that every single member on the House floor has a right to, debate. And he said, as long as what they're saying is germane to the issue, they should be able to speak. And he said it shouldn't matter if somebody is repeating what somebody else said. That shouldn't limit anyone's right to debate on any subject. Representative Drew Stokesbury, Republican from Auburn, he noted there are already other restrictions around debate to prevent frivolous delays. So he questioned the need for the rule change made by Democrats. I mean, he pointed out there's like a 3-minute time limit on speaking. And unlike certain other chambers, you can't just get up there and, read the phone book or a Charles Dickens novel. So, he pointed out, with a little humor that, there are already limits. So, why are Democrats doing this? So it's going to be very interesting to watch the session go on from here. We're just, I think in the third week of a 105-day session, and it's going to be interesting to see how this impacts proposed legislation. So, like I said, this caught Republicans by surprise. Actually seemed to catch everybody by surprise. I was surprised by it. And when 1893, to go back all the way to 1893.
Well, so you mentioned that the Democrats have 59 seats, but only 54 legislators voted to alter the rule. Was that
some of the legislators might not have been on the floor at the time? Okay. So this new rule means that instead of the 2/3 of the people on the floor voting to end debate, now it's just a simple majority. So it makes it that much easier for Democrats to quash debate, as it were, and that's what a lot of Republicans are worried about. So, like I said, it'll be interesting to see how this impacts legislation.
So then, was the vote completely along party lines? No one on one side?
I don't believe any Republicans voted for this. this change, not surprisingly. So yeah, they made a few other changes while they were doing this. The big one was the changing the rule from 1893, but they also implemented a rule where the governor can no longer bring his staff onto the floor. And they also got rid of, and this is a good thing, I think, title-only bills. So when you introduce a bill, it can't just be a title. It actually has to have some legislation, has to have some text, some wording.
Thanks to Eliana and Brett for covering that story. You're listening to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. And I have a new rule that I would like to propose for everyone in the state of Washington, that each week you check in with Washington in Focus and our YouTube channel at the Center Square. We'll see if we can get that in the legislature and get that passed. And we're hoping that'll go for 133 years, not 132. Moving on to our next story. In Seattle, the Sound Transit CEO declared an emergency. And anytime emergency is brought up, that's not usually a good thing. So let's find out why. Eliana Kernodle, Spencer Paul, you're going to cover that now.
In Seattle, Sound Transit's light rail reliability issues led its board of directors last week to ratify an emergency measure to hasten work on necessary fixes. Joining me to tell us more about this is Washington reporter Spencer Pauley. Spencer, why did the Sound Transit CEO declare an emergency?
So basically, Sound Transit CEO Goran Sparman declared this emergency in order to expedite the process on fixes with the agency's reliability issues. Now, Sound Transit serves basically like Seattle's subway system. It's what I take to get around the city. When you have so many cars, there's traffic backed up all over the place. Sound Transit's the way to go. Now, there's definitely reliability issues, and that's something you can see often. In fact, I have some data for you. Through the 11 months in Seattle last year, Sound Transit reported 376 hours of disrupted services out of 6,500 total service hours. That's 6% of total hours that have been disrupted. And Sound Transit basically said that's unacceptable. So what we're doing here now is we're setting aside $1.5 million for an existing contract. And this contract will go to finding out how we can fix these issues in a more increasing manner.
So what's causing these reliability issues?
That's a good question. So Sound Transit told me that its service interruptions are due to issues with its latest light rail vehicles. Its newest ones already have some issues that are mechanical. So that already needs to be fixed, which is unfortunate. But there's also signal malfunctions within its this train control system, and this causes delays. And of course, you have your electrical outages. And all this together causes issues with Sound Transit. And I see it all when I travel. Sometimes my train's delayed 10 minutes. And when you have to rely on a light rail system to get around to perhaps commute to work, people might find other options. And that's something I think why we're seeing the CEO Sparman here trying to fix this in a more urgent manner. Because if you keep having these issues, if that 6% goes up to the 10% or say anything else, you're going to see more and more people use something else other than the light rail.
A big thanks to Spencer and Eliana and all of our journalists this week for their coverage of stories across the state of Washington, from Olympia to Spokane to Seattle. We want to thank all of you listeners for tuning in each and every week, and to get even more great content in the state of Washington, go to thecentersquare.com. Again, that's thecentersquare.com. You've been listening to Washington in Focus, a production of The Center Square. I'm your host, Cole McNeely, and I'll catch you back here next week with another edition of Washington in Focus.